Thank you, Dina and Daniela. Great to have you join us this evening, everyone. My passion is, well, one of my passions, kind of a combined passion with native plants and also herbal plants. This evening, I want to just maybe introduce you to some native herbs, Southwest native herbs that you might consider including in your landscape or even your somewhat more traditional herb garden as well. I belong to both the Arizona Herb Association, which is a fabulous local organization. They always invite guests to join them. And I'm also a member of the National Herb Society of America. Both of these organizations use the working definition of an herbal plant as a plant that's useful in some way. So it's not just those herbs that are used for cooking or those herbs that are medicinal or maybe used for aromatherapy, but these plants could be used for dyes, for, oh my gosh, for a whole range of purposes. Now, some of these have more so historic uses than present day uses. In your handout, your main handout that you have, I've given you quite a bit of information as far as utilizing anything medicinally. Definitely you need to consult a professional, and I would certainly encourage you to do a little studying, perhaps if you have any conditions that might be contraindicative of using any of these plants as edibles as well. So since you have a lot of information in your handout, I am going to focus primarily on just how cool these plants can be in your landscape. Within your handout, you have information about approximate mature sizes, the type of soil that they prefer, type of sun exposure, and so forth. So I really want to focus on just the coolness, the attributes of the plants. Now, with our plants, I'm going to go through a range kind of from trees and large shrubs, kind of working my way down and including some vines, perennials, annuals, and a lot of really interesting and I think very unique succulent type plants that can be used as fabulous accents within your landscape. So let's start off. An herbal tree is the desert willow. Now this tree is pretty much found along low areas and along washes out in the wild. So it can benefit with a little bit more frequent watering than an ironwood per se, but it still can be drought tolerant. The difference is that once established, if you have a mature desert willow and you give it water about every 3 weeks, instead of maybe every 4 to 6 weeks if we haven't gotten a good rain, it will help keep it more so in bloom with these just fabulous flowers that will certainly attract hummingbirds to your garden. A lot of these have a delightful fragrance, particularly in the morning when you go out into your garden for a stroll. It's just a delightful kind of light floral scent associated with the desert willow. They're just generally growing, as with pretty much all of our true desert trees, growing multi-trunked. And in nature, you'd find them growing full canopy right down to the ground. And that's the advantage that our plants have used. It's an adaptation to help them survive with harsh summer winds especially. But these trees can be carefully, gradually pruned into a more traditional canopy, such as what we see here in this example, if you want to have space to move around below the tree or have an understory planting. These trees, they're so graceful and delightful, and the color that they can bring with their flowers, or even these beautiful white flowers, can have a cooling effect in the summer months, and just all around beauty can be added to your landscape with these. This is a fabulous shrub. It's actually native to a little bit higher elevation than our desert region right here, yet it still prefers and thrives in full sun locations. The oregano has, as its name might indicate, it has an oregano-like flavor. It isn't an oregano. Those plants and the genus Oregano originate in the Mediterranean, but because of the chemistry in the foliage, the leaves do have an oregano-like flavor. The leaves are quite small. The branching is quite dense, but when you get a closer view, you'll see the leaves are quite small. So it's almost a delicate looking shrub. The flowers are teeny tiny, but yet it's tough as nails. The great thing about this is you have these very tiny flowers through most of the warm season, and they will also attract butterflies and some of our native bees to your garden, so that you can also enjoy them, as well as the flavor of the leaves. It's a little bit strong, and some people might find it a little bit more perhaps bitter than they're used to. So if you're going to try it, just start out with a small amount and do a little experimenting with it, but it can offer a nice flavor to dishes. Here is a native that I think is just fantastic. Our desert lavender. Here again, it's not a true lavender. Those originate in the Mediterranean. The chemistry within the leaves is such that if you gently caress and inhale the foliage, the oils within it are a little bit similar to lavender. The desert lavender, it can have variable growth habits. Some of the plants will shoot up and be more upright than wide, and others are maybe a little bit shorter in stature and have a perhaps greater width. Kind of like people, those variations. Some of us are tall and skinny, others are a little bit lower in elevation and not as thin. So you can, if you have one growing like this and you don't like that, with some very careful selective pruning, you could encourage it to be a little more full in its branching. Now, when you get up close, because this is another one that has tiny flowers, the flowers, they're this beautiful kind of lavender or purple color. Very tiny. They will appear in flushes. Usually you'll get a few to several bouts of blooms during the year, especially when we have rains, but you'll definitely get a good bloom in the fall and in the spring seasons. These flowers, you can see how pubescent, how hairy those leaves are, so gently caressing them releases that wonderful fragrance. The flowers are great. They attract butterflies and hummingbirds, pollinator bees. The leaves can be used to make teas and cooking and so forth. Kind of a minty flavor to them, but this is just a great one. You definitely want to allow these a good amount of sun throughout the day. And locate them where you can caress the leaves so you can enjoy that fragrance. The brittle bush. I think too many people view the brittle bush as a weed, but it's just marvelous with its incredible bloom in the spring. The tops of these shrubs will just be a mass of golden yellow to the delight of many butterflies. After pollination, you get loads of seed that will support different seed-eating birds. But this is a nice shrub. My recommendation is make sure these are in full sun. make sure that you do not overwater them once established. If these are getting too much water, they will become huge monsters in your landscape. Instead of getting to be maybe 3 foot or perhaps 4 foot tall and wide, they will get to be more like 6 or 7 feet tall and wide. That's with overwatering once they're established. So make sure that you're being conscientious and making the best use of our water resources by not overwatering. So with all of our plants, we want to water deeply to encourage a good full root development, but we don't want to water too frequently. And I will add a note to this one. In the handout, you might notice where I've indicated historically it was used as a gum. I'm the type that if something's edible or has similar property, I have to try it at least once. I tried the resin on this. I scraped some off of a stem and put it in my mouth thinking, you know, gum. Well, a few hours later, I had to scrape that resin off of the roof of my mouth because it did not dissolve. It was quite pleasant tasting, but I don't see where the chewing gum came from, but maybe just a nice flavor to have in your mouth for a while until you just decide you don't want it anymore and you scrape it out of your mouth.
Kirti, Jess
Yes.
has a question about the brittle bush. She's wanting to know if you can stop watering them at some point.
Okay, I am all for the concept of rain gardens where we pick very, very drought tolerant plants to incorporate in our landscape, and we do contouring for water harvesting. And then once our plants have gotten established and have a good full root system developed, basically we depend on rainfall alone. Well, we know from the last few years, sometimes the rain just doesn't come. So I would say in theory, once established, they could definitely survive on rainfall, but unless you want it to take a real big dive, and you know, if it's too much of an extended period of drought, perhaps even you know, death, I would say have a backup means of water.
No,
So
I think that's a good plan,
Sure.
Kirti. So generally, they can be taken off of a drip system possibly, but definitely have a hose backup for those non-soons like we had the last couple of years.
that would be my recommendation, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Much better said than how I put it. We have different species of ephedra native to our region. There are just 2 of them that are likely available in our landscapes, in our nurseries, and those would be, they're listed on your handout, the Ephedra nivedensis and the Ephedra viridus. For most of us, the major difference is one's a little greener, grayer green, one's a little more yellow green. I really want to stress to get this beautiful form and these upright stems and loads of stems, you need to plant this where it will be out in full sun all day. If it's in shade, that's just not a good thing. This is one of the Ephedra nivedensis. They have a little bit more of a grayish green color to them. And you can see with the Mormon tea, the leaves are more scale-like, and they might even drop with real drought, but this is all you get as a leaf. So it's mainly these stems. When these aren't grown in full sun exposure, this is what tends to happen. They just get floppy, and these stems should be vertical. They should be stiff and rigid and upright. So keep that in mind when you're locating one of these in your landscape. You want to maximize the sunlight, perhaps preferably full day sun for your Mormon tea. So we have the nivedensis, it's a little bit more gray-green, and the viridus, that specific epithet indicating yellow. So it's more of a yellow-green color. These are just fabulous. Depending on how frequently you water them after they're established. You can expect these to get maybe 3 to 4 feet in height and spread. Some that are really aged and perhaps getting a little more frequent watering might even get to be about 6 foot tall and 6 or 8 feet wide. So with a lot of our shrubs and trees, once they're established, we can kind of guide the mature size with our watering frequency. And that's one thing I think we could do with the Ephedra also. And they aren't flowering plants. They actually produce cones. We have separate male and female plants, which is referred to as dioecious. We find this in some of our plants. We'll see this again with our jojoba later. The female cones, once this little stigma gets pollinated, it'll produce the seed. The male cones, they just produce pollen. It's very fine. It travels through the air, and we'll hopefully find a female. But just a little interesting fact, they don't produce flowers, they produce cones. This is a fabulous plant. You can, consider it a shrub, small, low-growing shrub, or maybe a ground cover even. The flat-top buckwheat is tough as nails. It's another one of those that, in spite of being so tough, these tiny, delicate flowers are just so beautiful in contrast to that roughness, toughness of the plant. Flowers will appear in the spring and again in the fall. You have very small, kind of grayish green leaves. Once the flowers are pollinated, little seed structures will develop. And when you've got a good pollination, you get a different color covering your buckwheat. It'll be almost like a rusty brown color. And you'll get seed-eating birds visiting to take advantage of the very tiny, tiny, tiny seed that is developed with the buckwheat. So, and if you like to keep things more tidy, once the seeds have matured and maybe the birds have had their opportunity to partake, you could clip these bloom stems that rise above the foliage of the plant. You could clip them to give it a little tidier appearance. This is another plant that would be beautiful, probably prefers being out in a full sun exposure in your landscape. Now, broom snakeweed, like the brittle bush, a lot of people think of broom snakeweed as horrible weed, get rid of it, no value. And it is a problem. If you're, raising cattle, it is toxic to them. And this is a plant that can be a little bit opportunistic in that it will easily kind of move into disturbed soil. And what do you have when you have cows roaming around? You have disturbed soil. In the landscape, however, I had one of these in a previous yard. I had one for 7 years, and I am very water efficient in my landscape. So I never, ever, ever had this reseed anywhere in 7 years. Although the plant was, had enough water to be vigorous and healthy, you have the spring and fall flush of bloom with the broom snakeweed that is a big attractant to a big variety of different butterflies. But it's just a simple plant. If it's getting a little maybe leggy or floppy after a few years of growth, you could give it a fairly aggressive pruning and then just let it grow again for a few more years. Just naturally, they will have this beautiful rounded form. The foliage, in contrast to some of these other desert plants, is a little bit more of a verdant, bright green. But you can see how delightful these little yellow flowers are that are born in clusters at the stem tips. You can see it's just kind of sprinkled through this landscape, offering that beautiful color in the spring and in the fall. Creosote, fabulous plant. You find this through a great portion through a few of our deserts in the Southwest, the Mojave Desert, Sonoran Desert, and extending down into the Chihuahuan Desert. Very, very, very tough plant, extremely drought tolerant once it's established. The creosote can be once established with minimal frequency in watering, it can have a very slow growth pace. And when it's grown like that, it might be a little bit more open in its branching, but the branches will grow slowly and they'll tend to get a beautiful, almost kind of a sensuous curvature to them. When we do give them a little bit more frequent watering, I'm saying probably at the most you'd ever want to water these would be every other week in the summer if it's super dry. That would cause a little bit more rapid growth, more dense branching, and definitely any pruning would encourage more dense branching. But I just love it when these are grown just very slowly and you can get that nice curvature. Another, I think very beautiful ornamental aspect of the plant. But either way is fine. They have just beautiful, bright yellow flowers, mainly produced in the springtime, followed by these little fuzzy fruits. They remind me of pussy willows, if any of you are from the Midwest, and these just glisten when they're backlit by the sun in the morning or evening. The stems are very interesting. They have these markings that indicate where small branches or leaves had grown previously. Just a great plant. And if you've ever heard that saying the desert smells like rain, it's the creosote that offers that unique fragrance. The oils within those leaves, the resins, are kind of, awoken when we have rain. And so that will just kind of filter into the air. The Texas Rangers. Now, there are so many different species of Leucophyllum, as well as in addition to those different species, so many cultivars, cultivated varieties. So the information I've given pertains just to what I would call maybe the plain Jane, Leucophyllum frutescens. So these can get large. They can get easily 6 to even up to 8 feet in height and spread. So make sure you do give them sufficient room. If you don't have enough room, there are smaller species, but then their qualities as far as uses would vary to some extent. But the Leucophyllum frutescens, it just has, particularly with the monsoon season that we've had recently, you get these flushes of flowers just covering these shrubs if you're not shearing them all the time. The beautiful, soft, silvery green foliage is just a beautiful kind of calming color in the landscape. And then you can have multiple bursts of bloom during the monsoon season on into the fall. The Leucophyllums, they can take a little bit of shade, but definitely if they're not getting enough direct sun, the bloom will be diminished. Mexican oregano. This is a great shrub that originates in Mexico, and it's not from the Mediterranean, so it's not a true oregano, but has definitely chemistry that affords it the flavor of oregano. So these leaves, they're just real bold, spicy. I think are delightful, you know. Use them with different pasta dishes or pizza, anything that you would use normally oregano in your recipe. The flowers appear throughout the warm season. They're teeny tiny. They will attract pollinator bees, and they have a sweet scent that to me is very honey-like. So that's, I think, another bonus. And this is another shrub. It's probably best planted in full sun exposure. It can take just a slight bit of shade. If we do have a hard freeze episode where we have temperatures down into the mid to upper 20s, it could suffer some freeze damage, but generally they're root hardy, and even with freeze damage can regrow the following spring. Oops. Oh dear. Oh, what did I do? Sorry about that. Malfunction on the PowerPoint slide here. This is the Rosemary Mint. It's native to higher elevation. It is absolutely fabulous down here in the valley though. If you give it a good amount of sun, that's best. If you like plants that are a little bit more formal in their form, more regular in their form, such as the broom snakeweed that I showed you that has just naturally a nice rounded form, this isn't for you. This plant is just kind of squiggly, free form, growing as it will in many directions. And in the spring, it will be loaded with very delicate flowers that are kind of orchid-like. Both the flowers and the leaves have intense minty flavor. So it's a great plant. As I say, even though it's native to higher elevation, these will do beautifully here. And it's relative, instead of that intense minty flavor, the rosemary mint has to its leaves and flowers the flavor. To me, it's kind of like a combination of kind of oregano and maybe a little bit of rosemary combined. Kind of interesting flavor. And these flowers, they're tubular. They hold loads of nectar, so it's a fabulous hummingbird plant. The flowers, you can pluck them from the stems and sprinkle them into salads for a wonderful flavor with a little bit of sweetness from that nectar, of course, or you can use the leaves in cooking. These, I'd say, probably in most areas of Chandler or Queen Creek, you might want to give these a little bit, just very light shade midday or afternoon during the hottest summer months. A little higher elevation, like up in Carefree, these can be grown, or in Tucson even, they could be grown in full sun. I think it's a little bit easier on them though, right down here in the low valley, if they do have a little bit of a break from that midday and afternoon sun during the summer months. There are different species of rhubarb found in Arizona, and we have, I think, one of the best ones for growing right here in our low desert environment would be the desert sumac. The let's see, I think most of the other rhubards are evergreen, but this one is winter deciduous. Great thing, before the leaves drop, around November, you will get foliage color. Might be gold, yellow, orange, or even kind of reddish, such as we see here. But then by November, typically the leaves will drop. Flowers are pretty small and inconspicuous, as we find with most of the sumacs, but the fruits that develop after pollination are quite noticeable. They range from kind of an reddish orange to red in color, and they are tasty, tasty, tasty. They share that common aspect with the other sumacs, that they're kind of sweet and kind of tart all together in one. So they're quite tasty. Very drought tolerant. This shrub, full sun or just a little bit of shade will do. This sage is native to Southern California. A lot of times we need to keep in mind the origin of some of the plants that we use in the landscape. That can help guide us as to how to care for them, as well as where to plant them in our landscapes. It's definitely the case for the chaparral sage. It's found in Southern California in areas where it just generally gets winter rain. Its adaptation to help it get through the hot, dry months is that it kind of slows down and takes a rest. We have to keep that in mind. Now, the chaparral sage shares kind of a common aspect to culinary sage. If you've ever tried to grow that, it is finicky about drainage. With the chaparral sage, you have to have a super well-draining soil. Otherwise, you will have problems when the monsoon hits. So this can get to be a beautiful, pretty large shrub, actually. The fragrance is intense. It's one of those plants, because the aroma is so strong, I think you either love it or hate it. I'm totally enamored with the scent of this plant. So every time I'm around one, I just want to like roll in the plant so that my whole being smells like it. But it's very strong, sweet sage scent. In the spring, starting usually around early April, these will kick into bloom. The bloom stems rise above the main foliage, and you have whorls of the flowers on this bloom stem. The flowers are great for attracting hummingbirds and butterflies, pollinator bees, and the scent remains. So I even love using these, clip some stems and just keep them in a dried arrangement for a while. Now, what happens, these will bloom usually from around early April through May. And then by June, they'll start to taper off. And that's when they begin the rest cycle. They may drop leaves. Leaves that remain are probably going to be small. They might even, kind of dry up a little bit. So it's going to look sad. What happens in July, August, when a plant looks sad? We want to give it more water. That's the worst thing you could do. So you can maintain your watering schedule, but do not increase it for this plant when it starts to shut down. If you don't have absolutely fabulous draining soil, and if you overwater, it will like overnight appear to have just been hit by a blowtorch. It'll turn crispy and that's it. So a fungus will attack the root system, and that basically stops the flow of any water, any minerals, and so forth. So it's a quick death. Sometimes you might have a part of the plant survive, but just choose a really well-draining soil site for the chaparral sage. Jojoba, this beautiful plant, very drought tolerant, is, I think some people discount it just because its foliage is boring. It's a beautiful silvery green, but even a plant like this with its small leaves, silvery green color, it can be a wonderful contrast to sculptural forms within the landscape, brighter colors. It can make those individuals in your plantings stand out even more. So if you remember back to the Ephedra, the Mormon tea, I mentioned separate male and female plants. That's what we have with the jojoba also. The female flowers, so these are going to be very small. Female flowers have that stigma, that receptacle that will catch the fine pollen that is produced by the male plant, filters through the air, and it's caught on these stigma sections here. Once pollinated, it will start to form the fruit that is kind of nut-like. It has a kind of a papery shell that will split open, and there you see the exposed seed. The seed, when pressed, will produce an oil-like wax. It's technically a wax, but it's oil-like in nature. And so this is this discovery, because it's such a fine oil, helped save the, I think it was the narwhal, from over harvesting to use as machine oil. But today we use it for machine oil and so many products. It's great for our skin. It's absorbed very easily into the skin. Some oils, used in creams and whatnot, might tend to kind of cake or remain on the surface of your skin as opposed to being absorbed. So it's a wonderful oil that is produced by the seeds, and the seeds are pretty tasty. To me, they have a hazelnut-like flavor, but there's a slight bitter aftertaste. I'm lazy, so I've only ever eaten them raw, but especially historically, people's used to roast them and then grind them to make a coffee-like beverage. So as I say, I'm lazy, so I've never gone to that length to try that. But they are pretty tasty seeds, I think. So that's our jojoba. The yellow bells, these are brilliant bloomers throughout the summer season with these good-sized trumpet-shaped flowers that will attract hummingbirds and just a range of wonderful pollinators to your garden and add so much color and beauty. So we have so many different cultivars and hybrids of the Tecoma available these days, and they're all going to have a little bit different chemistry. So again, the information I've shared on your handout pertains specifically to the Tecoma stands. And this is another one, if we have hard freezes, down to the mid or upper 20s, these will sustain most likely some freeze damage, but they'll regrow quickly in the spring. And the Western Mugwort, there are, these are beautiful plants, that silvery foliage. And that's pretty much why we would plant these, is because of the beautiful silvery foliage. And I just think it's kind of humorous. This plant that is native out in the mountains and pretty wide ranging actually. Some enterprising Brits kind of took some across the pond, played around with it, and then sold it back to us as Artemisia, Silver King, and Silver Queen, which you might have seen in the nurseries. A little bit more vigorous foliage, and there are other cultivars as well that are available. But these just have a beautiful foliage, just delightful form. The flowers are very small and inconspicuous. So this is one I'd say you're predominantly putting it as a landscape plant there for the beautiful silvery foliage that it produces. And again, full sun. I will caution you, if you do not have just localized water, if there's widespread water, this will spread. And there's actually some that you can see, this is a sidewalk, and there are some little shoots coming up here. They will spread if there's moisture extending in the soil. They'll spread by underground stems that we call rhizomes. So if you don't want it to spread, make sure your water is just localized. Put one emitter at the base of this plant and that's it. Keep it dry all around it. That will keep it from spreading. And it wouldn't be too difficult to pull up these runners if some start to escape, but you could certainly be very water efficient and just have one emitter and no moisture extending out from the plant. This is one of the Monardas. Within the Monardas, there are annual species that complete their life cycle within one season. And there are perennials that will grow more than, 2 years, more than 2 years. And this is a perennial species. Lovely, lovely, lovely. The plant will really, it just is mainly just kind of a dense rosette of stems and foliage for a portion of the year. And then during the winter, it starts to grow and extend these bloom stems. So by the spring, it will offer these beautiful flowers. And they are great for butterflies and hummingbirds, even pollinator bees. And then once the bloom season is over, you could clip the old stems. They'll start to look a little scruffy. You could clip them back and then just leave that basal portion, kind of a compact, almost little shrub-like form that will just kind of hang out through the summer. And then again, the next winter, it will pick up with new growth. Now here's one that I think a lot of you are familiar with, is the autumn sage. This is available in so many beautiful colors. I'd say go with whatever you like the color of, because the hummingbirds with those tubular flowers in their nectar, they're not going to be picky. These are in the low valley. I'd recommend that during the hot summer months, they have a little bit of midday and afternoon shade. That way they can stay a little bit more in bloom. Their peak bloom would be in the spring and fall, but if they do have a little bit of shade and they're getting watered maybe about every 5 days or so, you can have some blooms still during the summer months. So you can see kind of a pinkish red here, scarlet red, and they range all the way to these pristine white flowers on this Salvia gregii. So many of these things that we just look at is, oh, it's pretty in the landscape. Sometimes people are like, oh, wow. So if you have one of these growing in your yard, go out and take a little nibble of a leaf and see if you like that sage-like flavor. Here is a marigold, Mexican mint marigold. Some people call it Mexican tarragon. I don't like that name because to me, tarragon, French tarragon, is so unique in its flavor. Some people do use this as a substitute, but I think there's nothing that can compare to French marigold. But anyway, and this is a good example. I recommend when you're going to a nursery that you take the botanical name with you. That way, you can help ensure that you're getting the plant that you like. Through most of the year, this is beautiful foliage, kind of upright stems, and then usually October 1st. I kid you not. I think this plant watches a calendar. Usually by October 1st, these burst into bloom with these lovely, kind of 1-inch wide, beautiful little marigold flowers. And here you go. So when we're using common names, that can cause a lot of confusion when you go to a nursery. And usually these plants have just one botanical name. Now, with genetic studies, some of these names have been changing. And if there are changes, you might see on your handout with the plant names that there are some names that are in parentheses. These are old or synonym botanical names. And either way, the currently accepted name or the old botanical name, they're universal. But with common names, they can have such a wide range. So again, I encourage you to at least write down that botanical name when you're shopping. This, during a common winter, your Mexican mint marigold will just die back to the ground. It's not dead. In that respect, it is like French tarragon because that dies to the ground in the winter. Then around mid or late March, you will have new foliage pop up from the soil and have all new growth with this lovely form and the fall flowers again. So I just love this. It has kind of a licorice or anise-like flavor to the leaves and the flowers. Popey Red Diamaram. This is a wonderful annual plant that the young leaves are edible. You can use them like you would spinach. And there's so many different amaranths. Majority of them have green leaves. So this one I think is very special and can be very dramatic in your yard. So this one, it could take a little bit more organic soil. You could possibly plant this in a vegetable or herb garden where you've amended the soil, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in that rich organic soil. But the flowers are magnificent. Actually, the flowers are these teeny tiny little kind of cream colored dots here. And the real color comes from bracts, modified leaves that surround those little tiny flowers. But once this cluster has matured and starts drying, you can clip that off and then you can harvest the seeds. They're a little bit larger than poppy seeds and they can be used in different ways, cooked in different ways. So, and that's a warm season, summer growing annual. Another summer growing annual would be epazote. This has a really rather unique flavor. I would not know how to describe it. I'd have to say that it's sage and oregano and I don't know, whatever else rolled into one flavor, you know, in one leaf. But this plant, it's, you know, still today used quite a bit for culinary purposes. And also historically, it's definitely had a range of medicinal uses. So, and I will caution you, if your epazote starts to flowers and starts to set seed, just be aware if you don't clip those seed heads off, you will have a forest of little epazote seedlings coming along. For some of us, that's a good thing. Here, your golden Shia is another summer growing annual. This gets big. The leaves are large. The whole plant is big, you know, like at least 5 foot by 5 foot. And this one, again, it would just probably be super happy in a vegetable or herb garden with that organic soil, but it doesn't have to have the organic soil. Flowers are tiny, and once they're pollinated, you'll get rather large seed that you can harvest from these little dried helices at the end of the season. And they can be used, you know, to make really refreshing beverages and whatnot. So there are different chias. They are even in different genera, not really related. A lot of the chias that are used, especially commercially, are in the genus Salvia. But again, this common name of chia, it just indicates a property of the plant. So the seeds of this plant could be used in a similar fashion to the other chias. So here we have A cool season annual. The other Monarda I showed you, the Fistulosa, that's a perennial. This is an annual. Plant seed of your spring blooming annuals. I'd say late October or early November would be probably prime. The plant will grow through the winter, and usually around April, these kick into bloom with these beautiful kind of rosy purple flowers. They're born in whorls. Now the Monarda Fistulosa, the perennial, the whorl of flowers, it only has one whorl at the end of each bloom stem. This Monarda will produce stacked whorls on the bloom stem. So especially with these spring blooming annuals, you want to plant them where throughout the winter they will get as much sun as possible to help them grow and be nice and vigorous. Another spring blooming annual is the desert Shia. So see, species, or the genus is Salvia, and with this Shia, it's Hyptis. So it's the properties of the plant. That's why we call them Shias. This is a very small plant in contrast to that summer Shia. The leaves, mainly we have a basal rosette of leaves here, and then the bloom stems just rise above that with tiny, delicate, kind of bluish purple, bluish lavender flowers. And they too are born in whorls, like we saw with those Monardas. And golden crownbeard, this is a beautiful plant, and especially if you're into butterflies, it can be a great butterfly plant during the summer. So this is a warm season annual. So, and the for ground cover, the Yerba Mansa. Now this plant, it is a riparian plant, typically growing where there's more water available in the desert. So this, I'd say, take advantage of any area, particularly if it's shaded, where moisture might persist. With this example of this bird bath, water splashes off of this a little bit and keeps the soil a little bit moist in the surrounding area here. And I have this growing in my yard, and it's grows around a bird bath that it doesn't have circulating water, so I flush it out at least every other day. And so I'm not wasting that water to keep my bird bath clean. The Yerba Mansa is getting that water. And as a ground cover, it spreads by these above ground runners, the above ground stems called stolons, much as we find with strawberries. A wonderful vine, if you've grown clematis in other regions of the country, this does not have the huge, colorful, showy flowers. They are very delicate, more demure flowers on this clematis. The seed heads are very showy, however. Following the summer bloom, the seed heads, there's one little plume connected to each seed in a cluster. And initially they're smooth, kind of a silky silver. And then the sheen kind of gets fluffy over time as they start to mature, and you get kind of a pink fluffiness to them until finally they mature, turn tan, and float away in the air. You can see this growing through some mesquite here. And there are, pardon me, different passion vines that we can grow here in the desert. This is the one that I'd say most dependently gives us edible fruit. The fruits aren't very large, not much more than a quarter in size. I call them one slurp fruits. The flavor is just like the commercial passion fruits. And this is one native to Arizona also. It does not produce edible fruit in our region, definitely. But it's just, I think, one of the coolest, funkiest plants. And each of the passion flower plants has sometimes very different leaf forms than others, and their bloom cycles a little bit different one to another. But any of the passion vines will support the beautiful Gulf fritillary butterflies. So now some succulents. There are different agaves that have historically been used for edibles, even some till, present day with some of our native communities especially. But even aside from that, they can be, the leaves produce a lot of them very strong fiber that can be used and so forth. So there are different agaves, different uses, and they all produce fabulous bloom stalks. Now, if you want to use your agave for cooking, you're going to have to kind of miss that bloom because you need to get it just as it's starting to send up the bloom stalk, remove it from the ground, clip off its leaves, roast it in a pit overnight, and then you get to taste this wonderful material. It's almost like an artichoke when it's finished cooking. You peel off the leaves and you've got that, the heart especially, and all of this. They range in flavor from one species to another, but some of them are more like caramel, others like molasses, but generally very sweet in flavor. And the hohokam agave is another one that it's very much used for roasting, and they just make beautiful landscape plants. The agave desert eye as well, and they have other uses. Even those bloom stalks harvested after the plant, that bloom stalk dies off, and this gentleman makes the traditional Apache violins with them. Bursaras. This bursara is the only one that makes it up to our area. I'd say South Mountain is its northernmost location, and they are limited by cold. So if you want to grow an elephant tree, I would even maybe recommend growing it in a big container so that you could move it and protect it if a really, really hard freeze is predicted. But this is a very interesting plant. The resins in the leaves and the stem have been harvested and used as an incense even. And then some native peoples, the Seri, use them in basket making. Choyas. For our choyas, predominantly it's the flower buds. Before the flower opens, that bud can be harvested and then either boiled or roasted. Very nutritious, very tasty, but you have to be careful in harvesting. The Euphorbia antisyphilitica, the Candelia, so strong, very strong upright stems if you grow it in full sun, which is what I recommend. That also will help ensure that you'll get maximum flowering. These are teeny tiny little flowers. They remind me of like little cake decoration flowers. They start out white and then transition to a pink a day or so after they open. And the prickly pears, they're different species. Some are used for, the pads, young pads are eaten, but they're just beautiful plants for the landscape. Now, do your research. They range in size greatly, but this is one of the favorite for harvesting fruits. The Engelmann prickly pear are native, very, very tasty. So between species, there will be difference in the flavor of the fruits, and also even within individual plants, there can be difference in flavors. This is in Mexico market where just, it's a common staple for a lot of people to incorporate these nopalitos into their diet. And the fruits, oh, luscious. Our native Queen of the Night cactus, below ground, it develops this big tuber, and this would be the soil level. Above ground, most of the year, it just looks like a dead stick. until around late June or early July, it will pop out these enchantingly fragrant flowers. They open at night. Each flower is only open for one night, and it's just spectacular to to experience this. And they do need some shade. Out in the desert, they have protection of an ironwood tree or a little leaf palo brea or something that they're growing underneath it. And it gives their thin stem support as well as shade for the overall plant. And if those flowers get pollinated, oh, these fruits taste so delightful. But you have to beat the birds. You can see there's a hole through this one. That fruit is cleaned out. No pulp left in it. This one, there's a hole there. So, it's same as with any fruit. You have to share with the birds, maybe bag the ones you want to save for yourself. With our yuccas, there are two main groups of yuccas, those that are low growing and might be spreading, and those that slowly develop into a tree-like form. So one of the low growing is the banana yucca, and as its name indicates, produces an edible fruit. So most of the yuccas produce flowers in the spring, somewhere from early to late spring or early summer. The majority of them have kind of a cream colored flower or might have a little bit of a pink tinge or greenish coloration to it. So the banana yucca, it's low growing, and over the years, it will develop more stems from the base. And if the flowers do get pollinated, it will produce these fruits that are banana-like. They can be eaten raw, but you probably prefer to cook them. They'll be sweeter. And unfortunately, I've never had the opportunity to taste one of these, but I have it on a good word that they're very, very tasty. They're, like good authority. Also, definitely don't eat too many raw ones. You will be visiting the restroom a lot. And even some of these plants' roots have been used for basket making and so forth. The leaves of the banana yucca have super, super strong fiber, and historically they've been used for making rope, or even without pounding away the pulp. They can be used as ties in such a manner as we see here. And here's one of the tree species, the soap tree yucca. These can get slowly quite tall, and for this particular species, the bloom stem rises even farther above the main foliage rosette. But they're just delightful features in the landscape, and the very supple leaves of the soap tree yucca have been used for basket making, and as the name indicates, roots will provide a soap-like substance that historically especially was used by native peoples. So that's just a few plants that you might investigate. And remember that broad definition of an herbal plant. It's a plant that can be useful in some way. I would encourage you, if you don't have this booklet here, go to the AMWA website that we see here. And this booklet, actually, I think that on the website, it's even better because you can experience more photographs of each of the plants that is listed in the book. But you can use also on the website, it offers a search feature, which is really, really cool. You can enter all these different parameters, and it will then provide you with a selection of plants that might be of interest to you. I don't think any of the searches indicate herbal, but you can use a lot of other parameters for searching. So I thank you, and I hope that either some of these plants you might be very, very familiar with, but didn't realize that there were any uses for them other than looking pretty in your yard. And hopefully I even introduced you to some plants you weren't familiar with that you might include in your landscape or garden at some time. So we do appreciate you joining us this evening. And I think, do we have any questions, Daniela?
We actually don't. We just had the question from Jess earlier about watering the brittle bush.
So, well, if you think of questions later on, you know how to reach us. We have the emails for both Chandler and Queen Creek here. And I think you'll be sending a link for an evaluation. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep. So thank you, Kurti, for such a great presentation, and thanks everyone for attending tonight. We do have more workshops if you're interested. You can check those out at chandleraz.gov /water or through the town of Queen Creek, as well as some other resources we have available for you. But yes, as Kurti mentioned, if you have any questions, now is the time to ask them. But if you think of something later, you can email us here based on the info on the slide. And then as we end the class, you will see a short survey pop up. And so if you could just take a minute, we would really appreciate your feedback so we can create future classes or improve the classes that we have currently running.